Hello, Mark from the Varn blog, and I'm here with one of our most popular guests, Benjamin Studebaker, and just want to say a guy I've become mightily fond of after initially being a little bit hesitant to even talk to you. So we're talking about your new book, which has one of those great names. I actually like that you didn't put it in some subtitle, that your book is literally just what it is, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies. And I'm just going to also contextualize the date we're recording this, even though this is coming out in 2025. We are recording this at right after the election in 2024. Just so you know, that's the context for this discussion a little bit, even though we didn't necessarily intend it to be. Although, ironically, I'm like, I must have subconsciously knew putting you directly after the election was going to be prescient. So, Ben, legitimacy. What is that, and why does it matter to liberal democracies?
Thanks a ton for having me back to talk about this book. I am very excited to discuss it. This one is precious to me. I do love it. So yeah, legitimacy. The way I think about it, legitimacy and ideology are two faces of the same concept. They're both the narratives that sustain the order, right? And the legitimation point of view is the point of view of wanting to explain or justify. It's the point of view that takes the states and the elite and the ruler seriously as someone who potentially might actually have legitimacy, right? And the ideological point of view is the critical point of view, the point of view which says, well, of course, this is bullshit, right? And in this book, I try to put these two perspectives in conversation. So when we talk about legitimacy, we are always also talking about ideology and vice versa in this book. But of course, the language, as is my tendency, is going to be mainly the language of liberal realism, because that is the kind of language that in the academy more people are familiar with. And it's the kind of language that speaks to a larger audience. But you can translate all of it over into this language of ideology. And there are points in the book where I do this explicitly. The way I frame it, a legitimation story is an explanation, for something the state is doing or not doing, right? So it's an explanation for a state act. And it usually involves some kind of abstract value, what I call legitimating abstraction. This abstraction is nebulous. It's not entirely clear what it means from the word in itself. It doesn't have one obvious consensus definition, right? So if you do something, you then go, well, I'm doing it to advance this value, this abstraction. And then you have to concretize that abstraction. You have to show how the abstraction actually connects to the action. And I refer to this as the conceptualization, right? So when you conceptualize the abstraction, you apply it to the action. And that gives you a complete legitimation story, or if you prefer, ideological narrative.
So I guess one thing I have to ask is, how is this concept of legitimacy both more and less explanatory than, say, the old Marxian concepts of ideological explanation?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about ideology, the tendency is to focus on negative criticism, right? But of course, the whole reason we have to do the criticism is that there is a sense in which this is functional, in which it actually does work, right? The purpose of these stories is to persuade people to accept the state's order, right? Maybe you can get them to endorse it, but even if you can't get them to endorse it, you might nonetheless be able to get them to accept it as good enough for the best that they can do, right? And in emphasizing the legitimation side, I'm really trying to get at how does it actually work? Not just from the point of view of criticizing it, but also from the point of view of how it evolves or changes, right? Because often when you subject an ideological narrative to critique, what will happen is that the state will reconceptualize the abstractions that you are criticizing, right? So if you say, well, that's not real freedom, the kind of freedom that exists in capitalism, that's not real freedom. Real freedom is this other thing, right? When you do that, you're not just criticizing the ideological narrative, you're also reconceptualizing freedom for the purposes of making that critique. So in doing that, you implicitly are not just critiquing, you're also generating a new language for legitimation, right? And if you don't recognize that this is what you're doing, the only way that you can really critique ideology is to kind of do it, right? The only way that you can ultimately overcome a narrative is to say, well, that narrative isn't quite right. These terms should be understood in some other way. And once you do that, once you're saying these terms should be understood in some other way, you are telling a different kind of legitimation story. And part of what makes your critique persuasive is that people accept this other story that you're telling. So there's a need, I think, when you're trying to displace an ideological narrative to offer some other kind of legitimation story. And that might involve reconceptualizing the abstraction, like we just discussed in terms of freedom, right? Or it might involve substitution. Someone might invoke God or nature, and you might go, those aren't the abstractions that you should be invoking. You should be talking about liberty and equality instead, right? So there are these shifts that people try to pull off. They try to get people to think in terms of different abstractions, or they try to get people to reconceptualize the abstractions in different ways. And in both of these cases, they're not just doing ideology critique, though of course they are doing that. They are also telling new legitimation stories. So they are also attempting in some way positively to take power. They're offering something that's positive, not just negative. But often the positive aspect is not centered. Or if it is centered, it is as if that's evidence that they're doing something wrong. A lot of people influenced by, say, Foucault will say, well, you're just offering some new power knowledge nexus. Well, but this is politics. Politics is about political order and whether this is the best kind of political order we can have or whether there's some other order we should have instead, right? And so, of course, in the process of critiquing one form of political order, you would probably end up proposing some other kind of order. It might be a very different kind of order. It might look nothing like the kind of order that we've had to this point. But unless you're engaged in a very, very kind of utopian project, you probably think that there will need to be some kind of story or narrative about why the new political or social order that you're proposing is acceptable or good or just or delivers on freedom or delivers on equality or fairness, or is democratic or is representative. There's some kind of abstract value that's going to come into that story at some point. Otherwise, why do you want it? Why do you want something else? There must be something that you want. Let's talk about what we want as well as what we don't want.
Why do you think that both critical theory and left theory in general has shied away from positive views of legitimation? I mean, I'm going to say we are going to get to more contemporary analysis here, but I do think we need to start historicizing the left's own response to legitimation, because I actually do see it as a weakness in particular to the left that we have against other forms of ideology.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes out of the legacy of the 20th century and the lessons that the left has taken from the 20th century, which is really a lack of self-confidence. The left, on some level, thinks that no matter how good the values of the left might be, if there's an attempt made to concretize those values, it's highly likely to produce an authoritarian state like the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China or North Korea or what have you, that would look unappetizing to many people. And because of this feeling that there's no way of articulating legitimation stories that are not going to produce something like that, there is a tendency to shy away and to only want to do critique. But if you only do critique and you don't propose things, then when the rubber hits the road and people are making decisions about whether to support you, they have no reason ultimately to support you. They can say, well, of course, all your criticisms of capitalism and of liberal democracy sound reasonable, but what else are we supposed to do? And that is what the boomers have been saying for a long time to us. They say, well, what else are we supposed to do? Have you got anything? And the answer is usually not forthcoming.
Right. There was a brief period in the 2010s where there did seem like there's a couple of left legitimation stories on the table. There was a less populist legitimation story. There was gay luxury space communism as a legitimation story. And there was catastrophism / apocalypticism as a legitimation story. Like those are the three major narratives that I would see. I think maybe now after in the 2020s on my ad, anti-communism as a legitimation story, but that's still a negative one. And anti-imperialism as a legitimation story, but that again is still a negative one. So why is there such a limited palette? Because it does seem like this has been a huge problem for leftists in trying to counter what is a crisis of legitimation and all the other teams, so to speak.
Yeah, this is interesting. One of the things that you notice there is that in some of the different accounts that you're referencing, there is some kind of hard fact that creates a different situation. And this hard fact opens the imaginarium, right? So in the case of space communism, there's some kind of technological futurist breakthrough of some sort that makes it possible all of a sudden for us to do different things positively. Or in the case of the ecological climate change collapse, there's again another event, a hard event, which changes things utterly and creates new possibility. I like to group these things together into what I like to refer to as Posadism. Posadism involving the nuclear event, which changes what can happen. If you're not confident in the ability of people here and now in our context to think together about something else that they might like to see, but you are nonetheless on some level committed to change, one way of remaining committed to change while disavowing the obligation to actually do the work is to posit an event, whether it's a positive or negative event, that would radically change the entire stakes of everything, and then to wait for this event to occur rather than doing something to actually bring about a better society. And I think this comes from this lack of confidence which human beings have now in ourselves, in our ability to do things based on our own beliefs and values. We have rejected the human in favor of waiting for either technology or ecological collapse to put us in a different situation. The movie that came out recently, The Wild Robot, I thought was a very powerful instance of this, where you have this robot that has all of these notions of what people want, and then it gets lost on this wild natural island and meets all these animals and discovers that what the animals want has nothing to do with what the humans want. So it tries to learn what it is that animals actually want. And then because it studied the animals and learned what the animals want, it's able to do this. And then it makes things wonderful on the island for the animals until the humans show up and try to reclaim the robot and put it back to human use. And of course, the humans are evil. It's the nature, the primitive, and the future, the technological, that are in alliance against the human. And this is a film that humans watch and feel good watching, because humans despise the humans so much at this point that there's no belief that it's possible to articulate a positive vision.
I mean, one of the observations I've made about Americans in particular, and by Americans I mean people in the United States before people in other parts of the world get mad at me, is that I spent 10 years, roughly 10 years of my life, a little more than that, of my 44 years outside of the United States. And I came back highly critical of US culture in a kind of deep way, and a Marxist. So, those two things kind of like exacerbate things. Although my journey towards Marx began in the States. But I have been fascinated by the, frankly, misanthropy expressed everywhere as a form of legitimation for one's politics, and aimed specifically at people within the body politic in the United States. So I think about, for example, the war on terror and the critics of the war on terror. And ironically, today, I would say after the Trump election, Trump come back, pulled a Grover Cleveland, and despite all odds, and it really is a historic event in that sense, like thinking about that train of development in terms of like, oh, well, they hate our democracy. And if you're trying to explain, you know, why this happened, and I'm not going to get into the pundits' explanations because I think almost all single causal explanations are shitty. You are also enabling the haters of democracy. And I was actually fascinated by that as a legitimation story because it is structurally identical to what we saw in the early 2000s when people trying to explain why certain things going on in the Middle East would have led to 9/11, while not necessarily endorsing or making excuses for it. And while ultimately a lot of those counter narratives did eventually win out, at the time they were rejected to court as endorsing the enemy. Now, I don't think that's unique to human history, but what do you make of that as a form of legitimation, particularly now?
Yeah, so I think there's still, because there is a lack of belief in alternative political systems that's come out of this legacy of the 20th century and the failure of the state socialist and fascist projects, there is this belief that democracy is really all you can do. So a lot of the discussion, insofar as it goes on, is framed around reconceptualizing democracy, imagining different procedures for democracy, making arguments about what's real democracy versus what's not, or the difference between a democracy and a republic you'll sometimes hear in the States. A lot of this argument is about what does democracy mean, because there's a shared understanding or view that there isn't something else other than democracy that you can do. So if you want to change the system, it has to be couched in some way in that language. You have to, in some way, reconceptualize the abstractions that are associated with democracy: freedom, equality, representation. It can't be something orthogonal to that because of this lack of imagination and lack of confidence in other possibilities. And so one of the ways in which this, becomes very controversial is that it becomes necessary to police what is the boundary between what counts as internal to democracy and internal to democratic values and what is over that line and in the category of unthinkable, unimaginable, not stuff that you can do. And part of what is going on now is that electeds have become very, very astute and effective at moving things from one side to the other for their supporters for the purposes of terrifying their supporters and making them vote. So what has happened is that a lot of people are framing things that could plausibly be treated as part of the category of democracy as authoritarian, so as to produce terror and fear in the voter base and drive them to the polls. And this has been going on for a long time. The Republicans have done this with respect to the Democrats, say calling Obama an Obamunist, the kind of Glenn Beck narrative about the Obama administration as an incipient, Leninist, Maoist project, which always struck people on the left as ridiculous, right? But at this point, the Democrats have picked up the same playbook and are now framing things that would formerly have been considered to be, not things they would have agreed with, as outside the bounds of democracy. And as this is going on, I think that people now have ideas about what's going to happen in the Trump administration that are very much divorced from reality. People think they're going to be sent to concentration camps. People think there's going to be some kind of Handmaid's Tale, or that there's going to be racial pogroms. It's become extremely, wacky, the stuff that people are believing because of this use of the concept of democracy and the sphere of what counts as democracy to drive voter turnout. And I think when we talk about authoritarianism, it's important to remember that people have very different notions of what's bad about authoritarianism. So some people, when they think about authoritarianism, they think about it as a single individual or a single part of the state with too much power. And other people, when they think about it in terms of a total society with a set of impersonal incentives that are Kafkaesque and irrational, but which nonetheless constrain what human beings can do. And these are very different images. And your response to each one would be almost diametrically opposite, right? If you think that one person is too much power, then you want a rule of law, a set of impersonal incentives and structures that limit that one person and prevent that one person from dominating everything. Conversely, if you have a set of impersonal incentives and structures that are handcuffing you, What you want is to strengthen particular parts of the structure to overcome and change and modify those incentives. And I think part of what we're seeing is that the Republicans think that there is a total system that is a bureaucratic, Kafkaesque administrative thing that is dominating everything in society and that requires some one person or one part of the state to disrupt. And conversely, the Democrats do not view the administrative state as posing that kind of threat and think instead that it's Donald Trump, the individual, who poses that kind of threat. And these two images of what is outside the bounds of democracy are very difficult to reconcile. But I think we should recognize that all of these people remain committed to democracy. They don't actually think that there is some other kind of state for them. With very few exceptions, you can find very small numbers of people on both the left and the right who would make explicitly anti-democratic arguments. But in both cases, those perspectives are fringe. They are mainly very online. You would not find large numbers of ordinary Democratic or Republican voters in Midwestern states who would espouse those views or often even be familiar with Twitter accounts that seem to have hundreds of thousands of followers, millions of followers. They don't really have very much purchase in the country as a whole.
Well, I am going to get into the specific thinkers on legitimacy you deal with in your book, but I do want to pull this thread out a little bit because it's very pertinent right now. This tendency to use negative legitimacy, you and I can think of one other thinker who's really talked about it. It's Michael Sandel, who I don't know if you cite. I don't remember if you cited him in your book, but he also talks about the change of the nature of the American state changing the forms of legitimation. So you have early or kind of organicist civic republicanism as both the economic and he doesn't use the economic framework because he doesn't think in those terms, but it's actually pretty clear from his own argument that it's implicit. That as the economic and administrative apparatus expands and you include more and more different kinds of groups who do not share cultural and or economic incentives, both. So you neither have a cultural nor a class cohesive base for society, that republicanism gets more difficult to justify in this organic sense. And in the 20th century, he says it moves into an administrative competence model, and that he thinks around the 1980s that starts to break down, around the end of Reagan. And he talks about that in his American Democracy book, which I have back there. And I add to that, and it's implicit when he reprinted the book, he added a little bit about fear as a motivating factor, but that around 9/11, or even really before it, really starting in the 90s, these traits of fear-based legitimacy that go back on the left to the Red Scare and go back on the right to Goldwater, although we can do the Hofstadter thing and talk about it as a strain in American political thought since there's been an American Republic, but it's becoming more and more dominant from the 60s to the 90s, and then seemingly it becomes the narrative. But this seems to have really negative effects on your political subjectivity, like an inability to even understand what other people are thinking, and an unwillingness. And this seems to be, I think this is exacerbated by technology and I'm going to sound like Jonathan Haidt, but by technology and by siloing and by the algorithm. But I don't think it's actually, unlike those guys, I don't think it's actually caused by that. I think its origins are older and deeper. What do you make about those trends, and do you agree with Sandel on this, or would you nuance it more?
Yeah, so on the cover of the book we have a Hydra. And I'm holding up the book because I really like the cover. It was made by designed by an artist who was a friend of my dad. My dad's dad, and I just thought it was a cool cover. But we have this Hydra, right, with these many heads. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think happens is that as it becomes, there's more disagreement in society, you get, it becomes harder and harder for the state to be for something and for that to produce adequate legitimation, right? Because when the state is for something in particular, there's only so many different stories that it can tell at once about that thing, right? And people who don't want that thing, who aren't convinced by those stories, will see the state as ideological and as opposed to them, especially as the state becomes stronger, as it does over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. If you don't like something the state's doing, this will seem very authoritarian to you. No matter how it comes about, no matter what democratic procedures are used to bring it about, it will strike you as very, very much in your grill, because the state is such an important part of life now. So as this happens, and you get more disagreement, it becomes harder and harder to bring people together with a hope narrative, with a positive policy proposal. So instead, the fear of what the other side will do becomes much more effective. And what that does is it allows you to tell all sorts of stories about how the other side is in all sorts of different ways vitiating key democratic values. The other side's attacking your freedom. It's attacking equality. It's attacking the concept of representation itself, right? It becomes very easy to do that and to frame the other side as posing this threat. And conversely, the other side can do the same thing with you, right? And tell huge numbers of stories about the threat that you're posing. Now, this gives you a ton of stories. And the stories all imply that you ought to get involved in democratic politics, even if the state does nothing additional for you, purely on the basis of stopping what the other side wants to do. And so this state generates huge numbers of narratives, and the more conflicts that it generates, the more narratives it can kick up. And this makes it harder and harder to confront the state as a unitary whole. Increasingly, people are fighting with some of the heads against other heads, and at no point is the whole structure being confronted. And I think that this, over time, produces a state which is less capable of taking positive action because it is much less able to generate a consensus around a particular course of action. So when action is required, it's very difficult for the state to do it and to legitimate having done it. And oftentimes, when the state does take action, this produces a period where particular politicians have to become the bearers of responsibility for the action and then flushed. And that's really the way that the state manages to keep going after it acts, because the individual actions will never produce widespread consensus. The particular politicians and parties who are associated with the action become the bearers of it. And when you flush them in the election, it produces this sense that you have cleansed in some way the state of the impure action that it took. Mm-hmm. So as this goes on, what I really think is happening is that before World War II, when you had a huge amount of this kind of disagreement, people would resolve it with violence. People would have a fight, they would have a war, they would have a coup, they would have some kind of struggle with weapons. And that would put an end to the disagreement, and it would qualify it and shrink the space for disagreement. That's become much harder to do because people don't believe that anything positive will be achieved post the world wars with violence. They don't think there's another regime that will work better, and they don't think that a violent struggle will issue in anything good. And as time has gone on, our willingness to do political violence, our belief that it's a reasonable thing to do, has diminished heavily, to the point where now if someone takes up a gun and does something in politics, we regard that as a mentally ill gesture, as an inherently mentally ill gesture. Even if somebody writes a manifesto where they explain in great detail why political violence is implied by their ideology, we will nonetheless psychoanalyze them and treat them as a crazy person. Ted Kaczynski would be an easy example of this. He has a manifesto which is very clear and explains why he did what he did, but nonetheless, we don't take that seriously. We assume he must be nuts, because we can't take political violence seriously as something a reasonable person could do. This means that there is no way of qualifying the disagreement, and it just intensifies. And so the only stuff that can happen that in any way puts brakes on this is interventions into the culture industry, interventions into algorithms online, or things like in the past, the Red Scare, closing up of the discussion, which is done by menacing particular people in society with social sanction.
Mm-hmm. I want to, while I agree that this is an interesting problem, I actually do think it is interesting how the complexity of these debates also seems to imply that the political violence probably really wouldn't work because there's too many factions to fight. You know, like I think about this when we deal with different right-wing ideologies. In the 70s, it was left-wing ideologies too. Interestingly, and I'm not quite sure why this is, despite the fact that there's more actual violence implied in left-wing political rhetoric. I mean, revolutionary models are explicitly violent. There is seemingly, at least after the 1970s, but even during the 1970s, like the violence was explicitly usually non-lethal. You know, we think about all these bombings that leftist groups did in the 70s, but they killed like 4 people and most of them were themselves. It's more than that, but it's not like, I'm exaggerating, but not by a lot. I mean, they really didn't, like, we remember them historically if they had been more, if they claim more victims. And most of the victims I think about are like, well, that yippie planted the bomb wrong and got blown up. That wasn't entirely true in Europe, but in America, that was usually the way that went. And so I think there's a, I don't think your book implies this, but I'm just saying this. I don't think that fear of political violence is entirely unreasonable, even though there does seem to be a double think about it, and that everybody uses language that implies political violence, but as soon as there is political violence, they want to run away from it as fast as possible. Not just for political consequences. I mean, I think it's a deeply ingrained, like, oh shit, like we don't want the 1920s again, or we don't want the days of lead, or we don't want the US Civil War, or whatever. And one of the rationalities for this that I think a lot of people intuitively know, but they don't necessarily have language for, is that because civil wars tend to be actually more violent than other forms of wars. That, like, historically speaking, civil wars are more violent than wars between nations, and they're more violent than wars of occupation and insurgency, because they are generally zero sum. And I think 2 centuries of that, well, maybe 5 centuries of that, really change things. Because you look at like medieval civil wars, they actually do not involve total social mobilization. So political violence is extreme in like in most, and I'm using medieval here colloquially, but in most medieval societies, but it is limited to elites for the most part, or for people who are specifically caught up in specific peasant revolts or whatever. The general population is not in general targeted, even if they get killed by knights. They were getting killed by knights anyway. So that change of logic does seem to be a modern problem. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, leaving aside cases where towns get sacked because the army needs food, or there's a need to boost morale by sacking a town. Leaving aside cases like that, yes, your characterization, I think, would be broadly correct. Yeah, I think that, so if you think back to the early 20th century, and even in the 70s, the assumption of many theorists in the 70s was that the struggle that was going on in the 60s and 70s would have a potentially revolutionary character, that society and the state would become opposed, and that there would be some kind of move by society against the state. And in my book, we go through a number of different theorists, some of whom are still around, like Habermas, who had this kind of view of the 70s as society versus the state, with the state either repressing society or making concessions to it, right? This supposes a unitary character to society, which is not at all what we have. We have what I call deep pluralism, a much greater level of disagreement, which produces all of the heads on the Hydra, right? So I think if you go back to the 20s or 30s, there's a point at which the disagreement becomes sharp enough that violence becomes possible, because people in those situations can imagine that violence might accomplish something. Mm-hmm. There's enough disagreement that people feel it's worthwhile to have the violence. And the disagreement is not so much that people can't imagine that they could prevail, right? If you have three different factions, the communists, the fascists, and the liberals, and they're relatively unitary and relatively cohesive, and they can make estimations of their forces, and it's the 20s, and state socialism has not yet been tried, and you don't know what's going to happen. You can imagine each of those groups thinking maybe a fight is the thing that will solve this problem, and maybe we'll win, and then maybe we'll be able to do something, right? If you get to a point where people can't imagine fighting in this situation, what happens as you move forward is that you get more and more and more disagreements within each of those three camps, to the point where the names lose their meaningfulness and become difficult to place. And it becomes controversial who's on which side, or if there are still sides about which we may speak. And so as this happens, you reach a level of disagreement where you and your tiny faction within the broader left or the broader right or the broader center, if those terms still mean what we think they mean, can't possibly imagine that you could prevail by force. There's way too many forces in society which sharply disagree with you about way too many things. Even the people that you're friendly with, that you get along with, that you invite on your podcast, don't agree with you about basic things that they would need to agree with you on if you guys were to cooperate together to wage some kind of armed struggle. So the level of disagreement becomes so vast that the odds that you would actually win become very low. And then we also have this enormous explosion in terms of the level of force that the state has at its disposal and the likely nastiness of the fighting, which is not just evidenced by the world wars, but which is vaguely gestured at by some of the things the United States has done since then in other parts of the world, and which also probably exceeds our ability to imagine, because we can't imagine, say, the American Civil War waged with the weapons of World War II, let alone with the weapons that the state has now. And there's all sorts of weapons that the state has now that we probably don't know anything about, and probably couldn't even imagine and would be surprised to see deployed. So for all of these reasons, we can't solve the problem with violence. And yet, historically, in every other society where very large amounts of disagreement have kicked off, the standard solution has been for there to be violence. So the usual mechanism for dealing with this problem is blocked. And this is causing us to invent enormous numbers of legitimation stories as we all desperately try to keep this thing going in various ways. Because all of us know that we don't have an alternative to it. We are constantly inventing rationalizations for it that conflict with each other in all kinds of ways. And I think that this is why American politics is so insincere. Most people, their legitimation stories are not sincerely held at this point. They are ways of papering over the fact that they fear civil war, violent death, and conflict. Really, most people in the United States today are functionally Habesians, who pretend that they have other kinds of values for the purposes of trying to convince other people to continue to support this system because they can't imagine an alternative to it. And I think this is the thing that we all have in common underneath all of the different things that we say that we don't mean. None of us want to die, and most of us are willing to sell out whatever it is that we actually believe in to avoid death, or even to avoid unemployment in the case of, say, cancel culture.
I find that interesting because there's two implicit things that I've dealt with, traveling the world and having seen the repercussions are, in some cases, actually witnessing political violence. And that is for all the American talk of political violence, and we do have a low nascent level that's a little higher than it was post-war, but it's actually probably lower than it was for the rest of American history. Not probably, it is definitely lower than it was for the rest of American history. And our political violence has been mostly aimed externally during the expansionist projects, but not always. I mean, and I'm not just talking about the Civil War here. I mean, there's all kinds of Shays Rebellion,
Bleeding Kansas.
I'm trying to think of stuff after the Civil War, and there
the
is
Haymarket.
Oh yeah, but the Klan. The counter revolutionary forces at the end of the Reconstruction, and even
the bonus army.
Right, exactly. And even in the 1960s and 70s, I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about the insincerity of American politics today is I have people who lived through and remembered stuff like the Rots riot, people around my dad's age, who would tell me they can't remember a time when America has been more polarized than this. And I was like, do you remember when you were a kid? Because it was explicitly. In fact, it was so polarized that I'm a believer in the theory that the Supreme Court made all these weird concessions about civil rights and different groups, not democratically, because there was no way to build a democratic consensus around them, and that it stalled what would have been a direct confrontation in society between different forces. But there were so many, like it wasn't just like the progressive North versus the Jim Crow South. There were so many different contradictions that were coming up. One of the things I always think about is when people talk about Jan 6, they always forget about the Puerto Rican insurrection that did the same thing. I believe it was in the 70s or in the late 60s. And there's an amnesia around violence in America, where we are a more violent society in some ways than, say, Europe is, although I'm always wondering when that stuff in Europe's going to break. But there's also the technological dimension, and people will point out that I use nukes, and nukes is actually more of a kind of symbolic reference for all the weapons. What I'm actually thinking of is like, what is your AR-15 going to do against a cluster bombing drone, or if when people see police surplus, they're terrified, right? Like what they bought from the military, and so you see these police with tanks, and I'm like, if you saw actual military gear employed here, you would be terrified. And you're also not dealing with like the kinds of irregular violence that you might see in a place like let's say Syria, where we could think about former Yugoslavia and the Balkan Wars, where people are like making bombs out of used bathtubs and dropping them from small airplanes. I mean, like these kinds of on one hand, you see this evocation of violence all the time, and on the other hand, there is no familiarity with that level of violence in American society, even if we are a more violent society than our European counterparts. And I think that is I am torn about that, because I agree with you. It leads to this stalemate where people literally have no idea what to do, and it gets sublimated in both insincere and often violent rhetoric that that people really don't mean. Because I always have this saying. I was like, okay, if you really believe in political violence, are you willing to shoot your comrade in the head to save your and their own family if they get caught? And this is not even, I'm like, this is a classic question that everybody was confronted in World War II if they had thought about it for 35 seconds. And like, I can't even think people like beginning to fathom what that means now. So, I think that's an interesting problem. Where do you think this impulse towards violence goes? Does it just get sublimated in insincere rhetoric, or what's going on there?
Yeah, and to kind of further some of what you were saying, people are sticking Ukrainian and Russian flags in their profiles. If they had any concept of what was actually occurring in Ukraine right now, they would be rooting for that conflict to end as quickly as possible. If they had any notion of what was actually occurring, in that case, what you have is relatively bog standard World War I style, heavy artillery, infantry running, from ditch to ditch, trying to take buildings in towns. Horrible stuff. People don't have any concepts. They treat it like a football game, like they're rooting for a team or something. The news coverage about it treats it like a sporting event. It's awful stuff. And people don't understand that. That's why they treat it in such a cavalier way. It's not that they really are so heartless as to have that kind of attitude to that kind of violence. It's that violence isn't real to them. They don't have a concept of it. And another thing on that point, if one way to get a sense of what this would involve is to make a friend who works in defense and ask them a question they can answer. Like, for instance, is the United States military more powerful or less powerful than we generally believe? A question I love to ask people in defense, because they always say more. They always say it right away. And they always look nervous when they say it. Mm-hmm. Because there is incredible stuff that we just don't even know about, that hasn't seen the light of day, that we can't fathom. So yes, on that point, I think people have no idea what would be unleashed if there was actual fighting. But there is some general sense, I think, that people do have, that it would be incredibly terrible, even if they're not able to cash it out and get specific about it. And I think that, yes, I think that mostly it's insincerity. I think in the case of the United States, we have an extremely ironic, post-ironic, insincere political culture, because no one can figure out what to do, but people feel on some level that they have a responsibility as a citizen to care, to be involved, or to try. And this produces a total lockup. And there's a lot of us who are in some way, shape, or form political professionals who are paid to track this stuff and follow it. So we're paid in some way to care about it. And yet we're not able to come up with something obvious that we should do, that we feel great about. So you have to find some way to continue to feed the beast, and it results in a lot of insincere posturing. I think in other political systems, particularly the UK, which I also talk about a lot in this book, there are other ways of dealing with it that are not available to us in the United States. So in the case of the UK, because they have a Westminster system, they can just change their democratic procedures a little bit to create a perception that maybe by changing the procedures, these disagreements will be resolved in some other way. Mm-hmm. And it takes a while for people to realize, after you've changed the procedures, that the change to the procedures doesn't actually unlock any greater possibility. And in that window of time, you have relatively ordinary politics. So in the case of the UK, an event like Brexit will not be processed as a futile gesture for something like 10 years, 20 years, maybe longer. It will take a while for the British public to go, oh, wait, doing that really didn't increase what we could do. Right now, there's a perception among many people in Britain that the leaders have failed to live up to the promise of Brexit as an event, and that if you just get the right leaders in, then all of a sudden this latent potential that the procedural reform has unlocked will be realized. And as long as a sizable number of people in the UK believe that, they'll engage in a very kind of banal struggle for power within the Conservative Party or within the Reform Party or for an electoral majority in the UK. And that will be relatively normal politics, with people being sincere and saying what they really think. And in response to that, there are other things they can do procedurally in the UK to kick things along. They can devolve power to the Scottish Parliament like they did in 1997. They can do a second chamber reform. They can swap out the House of Lords for something else. They can change the electoral system around a little bit if they'd like. They have a ton of options available to them. They can go back into the European Union. They can create participatory deliberative structures. They have tons and tons of options because their political system is extremely unitary. And because it's extremely unitary, their parliament can just vote different kinds of experimental procedural reforms. The danger, though, is that many of those reforms will reduce that unitary character of the British state and make it harder for the British state to take other kinds of decisions going forward and to make other kinds of procedural changes. I think the most effective reform in terms of just buying time for the existing system that I've heard discussed was a proposal by my old supervisor at Cambridge, David Runciman, to lower the voting age to 6, to make young people think that they have an opportunity to change things, because it would take them a good 20 years to figure out that they don't, at least. Each one of these things buys you a couple of decades in that system. The procedural reforms don't happen in the United States because our Constitution makes them extraordinarily difficult to do. There are things you can do around the margins in terms of, I think Facebook and Twitter and social media, I think that convinced the millennial generation that we had an opportunity to do something through the procedures based on our understanding of Web 2.0, that other people in the past, they didn't have access to Web 2.0 and therefore wouldn't be able to realize the potential of it in democratic politics. It's evident to us now that that was stupid, but we wasted about 20 years trying to do that. And that's all that you need in this system, is a good 20 years of people doing something stupid that won't work. And you can keep going for a long time with a very high level of disagreement, as long as you can keep finding these mechanisms for making people think that they're in a new situation that has new potential.
And what I like about your book is it makes it clear that this is not really planned. No one sat down in the Pentagon or in the White House and said, let's use social media for this to distract these people. There are counter evidences, like when this clearly sort of seemingly got out of control in 2015, 2016. You saw pressure from the government, which there's been a long-standing debate between me and Doug Lane about the nature of free speech in American society, of which I said the government has always used what is technically unconstitutional and illegal means to collude with corporations to suppress speech, going all the way back to the Hays Code, but really way further than that. And that free speech is something that we've enjoyed mainly in its limitations. So you have it, but like only kind of. And that was very clear to me in the way in 2020 that we saw this crackdown on political speech. I mean, through these large media conglomerates who are doing it because they're afraid, not so much of the political speech, although, there's some very bad PR stuff about stuff going on in like Myanmar and stuff like that, which always surprised me that people were surprised by. I mean, to be quite honest, because when I was like, if you think like all the color revolutions happened because of this, and if you think the Arab Spring and Occupy happened because of interconnectivity on the internet, then why do you think it would be limited to that? Like, I mean, luckily it's actually not that effective, but in some marginal cases, a margin, it kind of maybe had some effect. And so we see just political speech in general crack down on, but that really has led to this ability to perceive the world just entirely incorrectly, without one thing that I think is interesting about this legitimation story that is part of your book, but I want to bring it in here, is we talk about ideological violence. There's a counterpoint to that, which is like communities had more in-person interaction in a deeper way, for good and ill. I don't want to romanticize this as some communitarians do. In prior to the to World War II, like there was more consensus agreement because people actually had to like focus with people in small communities and make shit work, and you just had to figure out how to do that. And like that means a certain amount, even if you were the heretical weirdo down the street, there's still a certain amount of consensus you're going to be maintained because you got to work with these people and you have to just survive. And that isn't true anymore, in a very real way. And so that also means that this insincere kind of almost fantasy simulacra politics can like balloon like crazy. And I don't want to sound like I was always better, like I was always better than that. I got sucked into it just like everybody else in my late 20s, early 30s. Like, I could definitely see that it could go right wing. That was clear to me. But the idea that it was still like, oh, we can connect people, we can move. This is like the kind of connections we have in person, but we're no longer inhibited in the same ways. That was fundamentally wrong. And I think you're right that it bought things time. I think another thing that the legitimation crisis does is that we tend to see the psychological errors in people who are different from us in these legitimation crises, but we don't see our own and how much they are similar to them. Like, if you were to tell most Democrats that like their obsession with the Mueller report and Blue Anon is only more sophisticated but serves the same function as QAnon does. I said Blue Anon, but their obsession with the Mueller report are the Steele dossier, are Rachel Maddow's constant on cable television implying that like Russian bots put Kemp in office in Georgia, and stuff like that. That narrative is more sophisticated, but is basically the same kind of narrative you're seeing on the far right, or not even on the far right, on the right in general. And that when someone like Glenn Greenwald points out that Democrats also on margin did a lot of this in the aughts, and people go, nah, and I'm like, no, I do remember Greg Palast running Diebold election machine conspiracy after Diebold election machine conspiracy in The Guardian for nearly 8 years. And it was, while it was not dominant the way it became on the right, it was actually tested on liberal and left audiences during the Bush administration first. And it went to extremes. You know, Naomi Wolf may be a Trump supporter now and is a weirdo, but she was a weirdo back then too. And I remember a book that she published that everyone else has forgotten, where she claimed that Bush was going to coup so Obama could never sit in 2007. And that book was not a bomb. Like, people read it and took it seriously, and they immediately forgot it and pretended it never happened. So I bring this up because I think there's a tendency of good left-wingers too, not just liberals, to miss how their structural blindness is similar to the people they dislike, and that they also do not have a coalition to build things on. And I'm going to say this as a critique of Marx and Engels, and you know I'm a Marxist, and I often critique Marx and Engels. But there is this optimism in their revolutionary promises, particularly if you read like Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, where they're like, look, we're going to need political violence, but it's against a very small sector of society. It's just against the bourgeoisie. There's not really that many of them, and we won't even have to kill them all. It'll be very quick and done, and it's fine. And in retrospect, that was incredibly optimistic. And honestly, some of their other writings, like their writings on the civil wars in France, should have indicated that they wouldn't go that way. But that was a promise that socialists made, that yes, there's violence, but if we time this right, and that was another key element, if we time this right, the violence will be minimal. If we time it wrong, and this was Kotze's critique of the Bolsheviks, yes, we'll have to use more terror, and that is terrible, and it will exhaust society. We probably shouldn't do that. But then the moment comes, well, when's the timing ever going to be right? Like, it seems like it never came, and the violence just increased and increased and increased. I mean, so, you know, I'm looking at this from a socialist perspective, which I will give you a second to comment on. But this brings me to the other people you were talking about. I want to talk about these 5 liberal thinkers, or liberal-ish thinkers, that you think really have a narrative of legitimation, because I think 2 of them are fairly familiar to leftists. Habermas, and what's the other one that I would say is pretty familiar to left-wingers? Oh, Rawls, who I don't love, but nonetheless. But there's 2 that you cite that I have read a lot of and think are brilliant: Dahl and also my mind blanks. Dahl and
Bernard Williams.
Yes, thank you. And then there's the K guy who I've never heard of. I don't know.
Reinhard Koselleck.
Yeah, Koselleck. I've never read Koselleck, and I'm going to have to now. So, can you go through their theories of legitimation and, you know, why they became so ensconced in our understanding, even though most people haven't heard but 2 of these figures?
Yeah, Dahl is really, you know, early to the party. A lot of what people think of as having originated in Habermas goes all the way back to Dahl. Dahl was writing during the early Cold War, and Dahl, you know, makes the argument that to convince people that democracy is legitimate, you have to convince them that it's the best form of government, and that will necessarily involve convincing them that it makes good decisions and that its procedures are fair. Both of these things. Now, in political science downstream from Dahl, these 2 positions have become oppositional. And you have some people who argue that what makes democracy legitimate is the fairness of the procedures, and other people who argue that it's the quality, the epistemic quality of the decisions. These people fight each other. But what I love about Dahl is he understands that, of course, both of these things are relevant. You can't just pick one or the other. Democracy has to be legitimated in terms of both. And he makes the case that if people go through a period where they're confronted with epistemic failure, or they're confronted with procedural unfairness, if they are confronted with injustice, then for him, this will cause them to become revolutionary figures like Lenin or Gandhi. And he uses Lenin and Gandhi as the examples, people who break the law and organize in society to overcome the state. So what I like about this theory is I think it really encapsulates the way 20th century Cold War theorists thought about legitimacy, right? They're very ecumenical in terms of how you legitimate, procedurally, epistemically, doesn't matter. You've got to convince people that democracy is better, right? And better than what? Better than state socialism, better than fascism, right? So it's a competition, and is this better, or are the alternatives better? And what I love about the way Dahl sets it up is you can see very clearly how if you change certain elements in this schema, the whole thing unravels, right? Well, what if there are no alternatives? Well, then legitimacy can't be about saying democracy is better than fascism or communism, because those are discredited. You don't have alternatives, right? At that point, when people are confronted with injustices, it's not obvious that there is some other regime that they can compare democracy to and go, well, this other regime would take care of these things or do these things better. Nonetheless, they've still been confronted with the injustices. It's not as if this means that they are not capable of perceiving the system as having made bad decisions or as taking decisions in an unfair way. They're able to understand that, but that doesn't give them something to struggle for. And so it's not obvious to them that being like Lenin or Gandhi is a reasonable thing to do in response, right? But it matters still that they have lost their belief in the quality of the institutions. It's just that there's nothing obvious for them to do with those feelings, right? So that's what I really like about Dahl. I think Dahl is very underrated as a theorist, and I think he's sharper than a lot of people who come after him that have become, personally, I would take Dahl as a thinker over Rawls, and I would take him over Habermas. I think he's a better liberal thinker than either of those two, in part because the theorists of the 40s and 50s, the liberal theorists of that time, were very much focused on the need to defend their political system from these alternatives, which makes them very practical and very reasonable in a way that later theorists operating at other points when the stakes were less clear just aren't. Habermas and Rawls are really writing with the 70s in mind, and they apply thinking about stability, to this context in the 70s, which is really, quite estranged from the context that was motivating Dahl, which really is, the 30s and 40s. These are the things that for him were the formative experiences. So you get a very different kind of theory in Dahl that I just think more people should notice. When it comes to Bernard Williams comes at the end of this group of liberals. And so Bernard Williams argues that you aren't going to be able to produce a consensus on the meaning of a concept like equality. So you have to have, for him, some kind of consensus on something else. And that something else for him is liberty, which he understands as the thing you need to live alongside people who have different views about equality from you. So what I like about Williams is that there's this pluralism in Williams. There's this awareness that a level of disagreement obtains now that you can't simply get rid of or overcome through consensus building, but has to be in some way politically accommodated. Where I think the limitation is that for Williams, it's still possible to have this consensus on liberty to manage the lack of consensus elsewhere. And you see the same thing with Rawls. There's a positing of a consensus on the constitutional essentials and basic structure to manage the lack of a consensus elsewhere. There's a consensus on certain parts of his theory of justice, but not other parts which are excluded from the basic structure, right? And this thinking where you could still have a consensus somewhere else, and therefore you'll get away with the fact that you have disagreement, I think is still very 20th century. It's still thinking in terms of disagreement inherently posing a revolutionary threat. But what if we get to a stage where it doesn't pose that kind of revolutionary threat? Koselleck is a theorist who makes it very, very clear, right? For him, Revolution happens when there's a moral dualism, a gap between the values of the state and the values of society. In this latent period where this gap exists, there's a possibility to rectify the dualism and eliminate the gap. The state can act on society to bring society into alignment with it, or it can move itself to adjust to the values of society, right? But this way of thinking, where the state is one thing that has a coherent unitary quality, and society has one thing that has a coherent unitary quality, doesn't match at all deep pluralism, the many heads of the Hydra that are popping up over the course of the second half of the 20th century and into now. So that's where I really argue that my book is new, and what I'm doing is new and different and cool, which is to actually take seriously the level of disagreement and how far deep it goes and the consequences of it, all of the things that the disagreement makes impossible, that theorists in the past would have thought it would imply. They all think that this kind of disagreement means violence and revolution. It doesn't mean that anymore, in part because the disagreement has gone far beyond the limits of what they thought of as possible. They would have thought that long before we would have gotten to this level of polarization and disagreement, we would have started killing each other. And it's still the case that if you talk to like boomer, never Trump Republicans, this is what they think. They think that the language that's being used, the amount of disagreement that exists, just has to be too high, that there has to be violence if somebody doesn't do something immediately, because there's so much disagreement. They're not able to wrap their heads around the way in which the 21st century in the United States, the UK, and possibly a few other embedded democracies that have this kind of quality to them, just is completely different as a context from these 20th century, 1930s cases. And I do think it really is the thing that we have to grapple with. We don't have a mid-20th century kind of system anymore. And therefore, the theories of legitimacy that worked back then and were really brilliant, clever theories. Dahl is an incredible thinker who had a wonderful theory for that period that really captured something about that time and place. But it just doesn't apply anymore because our situation is different.
I think about late Dahl too. I think about Dahl from the 70s and the 90s, which I worked through Dahl's output backwards. I started like How Democratic is the American Constitution and went back to like his polyarchy book and his which actually hints at some of the stuff that you're talking about in many ways. And then his
that's the one I cite. The polyarchy book is the one that is the most critical for my purposes.
Right. And then the Democracy and its Critics, which is also pretty seminal. And I've always liked Bernard Williams because he struck me as a more realistic version of Isaiah Berlin, like Isaiah Berlin, but for realists this time, and not going the John Gray like route that John Gray took Isaiah Berlin's work, but which is just, cosmic pessimism. Although I'm pretty close to there, I'm not gonna lie. I do think it's interesting. I think it's interesting how hard it is to get leftists to read anyone but Rawls and Habermas, who I think, like you, are actually the two weakest in this five. Habermas being so weak is actually interesting to me because he's a product of a school of thought that was all about critique, and I guess he found it dissatisfying. But what he offers is like, I don't know. I mean, like discursive society between the state and society that pretends that these are unitary things, which, the state is not unitary. Even in unitary governments, it's not actually unitary. That's why there is a deep state, Virginia. And society being unitary today seems like, like in so much that it was ever unitary, which is questionable. Seems like such an absurd proposition that I don't know why people take it seriously. Like if you travel around the country and get off the internet and spend time in different parts of the nation, you realize that our society in the United States is hardly unified. And then you can even go to a smaller country like the UK. And I'm not saying this because I've done it, because I haven't, but I know plenty of people have, who will tell you the same thing about a country that has a much more coherent governmental system, a much longer cultural tradition, and is, I don't know, tiny compared to the United States, which is a continental order. And yet like Dorset to Manchester is not really one coherent civil society. Much less all of the UK, particularly when you start including Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland into it. And so it seems crazy to me that we think we can produce like a unitary subject. And I think you even see this in left-wing thought. Like there's increasing focus on left-wing thought. During the 90s, they were like, oh, it's too late for a program. We can't agree on a program. We just have to do critique for forever, I guess. That's the 70s to the 90s period. Now we're back to programmatic unity, but programmatic unity is because we realize that there cannot be any ideological unity. Like we've seen the attempts to build ideological unity, and what they actually build is like countercultural, subcultural cults. They don't actually build political movements. And we see it over and over and over again. And while we have our Marxist explanations as to why that happens, I think your book actually clarifies, in ways that some of the Marxist stuff doesn't, why we're so given to that and why it would happen so often. Because there's a limit to the amount of people we can get to agree on that level of organic society, like in an organic way, or even in a superficial way. Like in the moment you try to enact anything with that level of organic unity, it almost inherently splits. And people will say, oh, it's Trotskyism. And I'm like, no, it's not. I mean, like, I can't think of an ideological left-wing tendency in the United States. It does not have this. Actually, in the Western world, that doesn't have this character. Maoism, Marxist-Leninism, anarchism, social democracy, primitivism, even the visions for what that is almost inherently splits incredibly quickly. And unfortunately for us, I find that the only people who talk about that in any really meaningful sense are often like the kind of people you're talking about, and then like late 20th century reactionaries who are still alive, like Thomas Sowell. Like, and everybody else.
The right is more interested in intra-elite conflict, because the right thinks that's where all the action is. The right is dismissive of the workers and thinks everything is intra-elite conflict. So it's all the right ever talks about, but then we don't talk about it at all.
Right.
So that's been the gap.
The right is, and I always say this when people are like, oh, conservatives are stupid. And I'm like, dude, but rightists don't think that the rank and file conservatives matter. They can throw Ben Shapiro out to them all day. That's not what they believe. That is for public consumption. What they believe is closer to what Peter Turchin is talking about, or what Michael Lind is talking about, or what John Mearsheimer on international policy is talking about, or whatever. They see the working class. Actually, they see most of the population as an inert mass to be manipulated. And they're not, if you actually read the different schools of right-wing thought, which are very different from each other. I think people miss that too. Like this polyarchy thing, or this, like these debates, I think they're actually sometimes more extreme on the right than they even are on the left. They have less values overlap.
Oh yeah. I was at a conference in Germany where I heard Patrick Deneen give a talk about the Straussians, who are a problem for him because they hate his project.
Mm-hmm.
And he views them almost as this quasi-conspiratorial thing that exists in the universities, that anytime anybody tries to do something that he regards as a more open-ended kind of right-wing project, the Straussians kill it. It was fascinating to hear him talk about that, and how he regards them as really posing a quite sharp threat to his entire project, what he wants to do. And for him, that's entirely intra-right, intra-elite. It doesn't have anything to do with the left or the workers.
I mean, even like marginal groups like libertarians, I remember like the fight between like the paleo libertarians and the von Mises Institute, the standard Cato libertarians, and the left libertarians, which is a confusing term because it's used by two groups that don't actually share the same ideology at all. Chomskyites and Roderick Long. If you don't know who Roderick Long is, he's a marginal figure who used to be aligned to the Mises Institute and was a Rothbardian, but also believed things like racism is bad. So like there is this intra-libertarian civil war, which was actually solved basically by a lot of people defecting to different camps. It wasn't solved within the libertarian ideology at all. It still wasn't. I think we saw it at the Libertarian Party caucus. The Libertarian Party convention this year with like a former friend of mine, Michael Rettenwald, leading the von Mises caucus, Trump trying to lead some kind of Republican conciliatory camp, and then the standard old Gary Johnson guys winning again out of the conflict between the two. So this is universal. The left is so used to talking to the left that they don't know that. They don't have any conception of that. And even when the left tries to present this, like with their leftist or soft leftists, like Sam Adler Bell and Michael Stillman, will try to not Michael, Matthew Stillman over there at Know Your Enemy. Will try to I think about all these authors who are writing on Ayn Rand in the 2010s. And I'm like, you're already too late. The fact that you're writing about it actually indicates it's already over. But you have like the left wing, right wing whispers, but they often do not portray the divisions amongst the right accurately. And I think it's partly because they don't want to admit that this is a general social phenomenon, not just a problem of left wing ideology or activity or practice or whatever. What do you make of that?
I think a lot of them also just, they're not able, because they don't have enough time because they work other kinds of jobs. They're not able to spend enough time reading around that stuff. And also their jobs tire them out, stress them out. When they have time to read, they want to read stuff that they might enjoy. Whereas you and I have had in our lives an opportunity to read more widely, I think, than most people. And that's partially why we have these weird views that are so strange.
Yeah. And I also I don't think it's a small thing that you live in Indiana and I come from Georgia and live in Utah. Like it's just like I deal with people who do not show my worldview every day. Like it is requirement of me. And I also, because of jobs that I've done, I've had to move in a lot of different social classes, and most people don't. I mean, that's another thing about the United States. It's a very, like when you tell white middle and upper middle class people that they are middle and upper middle class, they tend to be like, what? Like, are the number of, I know the Felson tropes is a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, where you tell like these people like, the fact that you have time to go back and live with your parents, even though you didn't have an income until you were 35, actually indicates something about social wealth that has a class habitus thing to it that you should probably take more seriously than you are. That is lost on people too, because they and it's not because they don't experience real deprivation. Some of them do, but they have social and familial resources that other people don't have, and thus they also have leisure that other people don't have, or the ability to weather certain kinds of crises of long-term unemployment. Like, in my case, since I come from a blue-collar background, if I'd have been unemployed for more than 6 months at any time in my life, I would have been homeless. So, you do whatever you have to do. And those attitudes are very different. But I've also had a lot of time to read and explore the world. Most people don't get. It's been luck and a privilege. And you and I are both weirdos who enjoy that. Like, I do not mind sitting and reading 100-page, 200-page, 500-page book by Paul Gottfried, not someone who, I think is probably deployable. But to try to understand his worldview, I don't expect other people to do that. Like, that's not something that would be enjoyable. And I'm not even sure that for everybody it's even helpful. But if none of us do it, none of us understand what these people think.
Yeah. And right now in the academy, there's been an explosion of kind of anthropological work where academics are studying right populists, in the way that in the past people used to study the populations of the colonial societies to try to understand how to govern them. That's now going on in the academy for trying to manage the right. And it's right now a very lucrative way to have an academic career in the social sciences, to study the right and to study ordinary people who have right-wing positions and figure out how to manage them?
Yeah, although it's funny what that also implies. Because one of the things that I find interesting about your legitimacy and liberal democracy that I think I want to bring up before we get to the three critics that you talk about is de-democratization is pretty thorough in most of the Western world. You mentioned it in the UK, but we can talk about it as a trend almost as soon as the liberal democratic consensus was established after World War II. We started seeing it slowly being disestablished from day one. So, what do you make of that too? Part of the problem, I think, is the legitimacy of liberal democracies is Hydra. But part of the problem is because of the Hydra, we're not actually all that democratic because we couldn't be in function.
Yeah, this is certainly a point that can be made. In this particular book, I try to stay away from taking a particular stance as to which legitimation stories are the ones we actually ought to affirm. Because in this particular book, I think that would be a problem. It would make it hard for the book to explore certain things if I did that. So I don't start from the premise that there is a correct way of understanding democracy or representation or liberty or equality. Rather, I talk about the different views that have existed and the way in which the struggle unfolds among them. But certainly, the book is very ecumenical. It's very open to being read from many different points of view. So there may be many different stories that you might have. At the end of the book, I talk about 4 different moods people can be in. And ideally, I'd like the book to be readable regardless of which mood you're in. Although if you're in the enclavist mood, you probably aren't in the mood to read this kind of book. But in principle, you should be able to read this book as a conservative, a liberal, someone in the negative mood, or an enclavist. It's not hostile as a book to any of the particular legitimation stories, ideological narratives a reader might come into the book with.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things we have to say is if we talk about de-democratization, we have to agree on what democracy is. So, okay. So,
yeah, and that's very difficult. Very difficult.
Really is. I was recently reading C.L.R. James, and he has this real excited thing about Athenian democracy, but then he doesn't even deal with the whole critique of it being Athenian democracy was direct democracy of a very small elite within society, actually, which is true, and it's not dealt with, and I think it's an interesting contradiction. I also
the thing that distinguishes it is that it includes the rowers and not just the hoplites.
Right, exactly. And the other thing I like to point out is the only society that is shorter lived than the Soviet Union was the Indian democracy. You're dealing with a highly productive and very well documented generation and a half. As at least the Soviet Union got, I guess, 3 generations. What do you make of this idea that has come up, I think, in certain circles, both right and left, that these legitimacy cycles, I think about Tainter. I was reading your book, and you don't mention Tainter at all, but I was thinking of Joseph Tainter. And the reason why your Hydra thing actually reflects his critique of everything. His critique is a critique of almost everything humans do, that as you build surplus and as things develop and as things become systemically more complicated, ideologies become systemically more complicated. And actually, that's probably a sign that things are going to crash very soon. I actually don't know. Where I disagree with Tainter is I'm there might be a crash, but it seems to me we're pretty good at kluging these societies along for several hundred years. So while you might be ultimately right that all this is a sign of crashing, even in your examples, these societies still might not die for such a long delay that nobody talking about politics would have a whole lot to say on it. But what do you think about that? Talk that kind of talk in regards to these legitimation crises, that it's actually just a problem of complexity, innate in humans.
Yeah, the image I like to have in this book is you imagine a brachiosaurus, big long necked dinosaur, and it wades into a tar pit. And as it gets stuck in the tar pit, it's got this really long neck, so it's not immediately going to die, right? And then if it can make itself into a Hydra, if it can grow lots of different necks, say there are a bunch of trees and maybe some pools of water near the tar pit, it could survive for an incredibly long time by just proliferating additional heads, right? Mm-hmm. But the more heads it has, the harder it is for it to try to struggle to get out of the tar pit. So its strategy sticks it in there very deeply. And the heads get different ideas about which ways to go and what to do. They knock into each other and it starts thrashing around wildly. The heads are mad at each other and are blaming each other for the situation, right? And you can imagine this huge creature. It's not in any danger of dying because it can get all the food and air and water that it needs. But it also is going to be very miserable and unhappy for a seemingly indefinite period of time with no mechanism of resolution. And I think that this is how I would describe what's going on, especially in the United States, where there's so limited, there are very limited mechanisms for generating an appearance of possibility here compared with other democracies around the world. We're just going to get into this situation where there's an enormous amount of disagreement. This disagreement seems indefinitely irresolvable. And so what people will do is they will either they'll have to come up with some other kind of system that they actually believe might be better and would be worth struggling for, or they have to give up on the political and defect from it into something else. And I think that there's a lot of focus on liberalism and conservatism, but the moods that are the most interesting to me are the negative mood and the enclavist mood, because I think those are really the moods that are significant when you're dealing with this kind of situation. I think most people will exit the conservative and liberal moods as this goes on. And one thing I found that is interesting is that there's been a recent resurgence on the left of kind of the liberal mood. People who think that the solution to this is to reconceptualize liberty or freedom and then establish a social consensus around the meaning of a new conceptualization, or perhaps an old conceptualization that they've revived or dusted off. Right?
Yeah.
And this, I think, really doesn't grasp the fundamental problem. The issue is not that we have a bad conversation about equality or equity, and we could instead have a much better conversation about freedom or liberty. It's that equality as a concept is destroyed by this process of degeneration that occurs with all abstractions you can introduce. So if you introduce freedom instead and try to emphasize that, the same process of conflict will occur around that abstraction. And you won't be able to get out of the equality equity debates, no matter how stupid they become, by pivoting to a different abstraction like freedom. There have been times historically where that kind of shift has been functional, but I think we don't have the necessary tools to execute a legitimation shift. And I go into some detail in the book about, how do you execute these shifts? How do they actually work? What do you have to be able to do it? And one of the problems is what I call the abstraction access problem, which is that increasingly these liberal discussions are professional class, they're in the university system, and they're to each other. They don't have social roots. So people often talk about this in relation to the party system, the hollowing out of the parties, a void in which the parties lack a social base and therefore lack the ability to structure the subjectivity of very large numbers of people. That only about 25% of the U.S. population is actually Democrats. Only about 25% is actually Republicans, and the actual involvement of most of those people in the party system is very limited.
Yeah,
right. So the actual ability of elites to structure the way ordinary people think is, I think, much more limited than is generally believed. I think most people are disaffected by politics and don't talk about it very much. But of course, we don't talk about them very much because they're not talking very much. We're not seeing what they think very often. And when they do say what they think, they're not going to say it in a way that will be algorithmically tractable. It's not going to be refined in such a way that it would catch and distribute. So I think that, I find it very interesting how there's been this tendency toward a sort of quixotic position on the left to move back into discussions about liberty or freedom. It seems to me to be a running away from the real problem, which is that at this point we have some people who have a negative attitude to politics in general, a negative attitude to legitimating abstractions, have an appetite for something totally different. And on the other side, we have people who are desperately trying to get away from politics and who want to form families, want to just get really into entertainment media, want to get into technology and into notions of the distant future. Some of them think of what they're doing as political, but many of them overtly don't and don't want it to be political, want it to be something else. And also, faith and religion is still in the mix here. And for these people, all of this stuff is just really, really a burden. And yet, because the state is becoming less and less able to act, all of these other zones are becoming dysfunctional as a consequence of the state's dysfunction. So there's enormous frustration even within these zones of retreat.
Right. I was about to say, like, I think about one of the things that makes the millennial experience different from their parents, the baby boomers, is that one, the left-wing propensity of the baby boomers was always kind of a elite myth that was based on elite baby boomers. But even Rick Perlstein's documentation on this, not that I love everything Perlstein writes, but proves that was never actually the general boomer society in the first place. That we talk about students, but students were an even way smaller proportion of society than they are today, much less, what they were in the 60s. And that, and then talking about, and also he points out that like the student protests were, even though they were not people who were necessarily hyper politicized or sectarian, they were also not the majority of students, just like they aren't today. I mean, a majority of students were sympathetic to, for example, the Palestinian protests, but they didn't participate or strongly care. They just think it's like kind of bad and maybe somebody should do something about it. Maybe. And that seems to be, I mean, that's even kind of they're even, as I pointed out to people, they're even MAGA people who think that. So, and I've seen leftists just totally shocked that like you meet some MAGA person built by the Nakba. I'm like, yeah, but you're believing these myths about what people know and think off of baby boomer media that has dominated everything for so long, but it's a false consensus now, and it's been for a while.
Yeah, I've met a lot of Republicans who view Trump as the peace candidate.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, I've had arguments with people, even some people I'm writing an article with, about whether or not he's sincere about that. And I just like, it doesn't kind of matter, but we actually know that Trump has done both things. I mean, demagogic figures do that. And Trump is harder to predict than machine Democrats. Like we actually do. I think society does have a general model what machine Democrats are going to do, regularize prior Republican parties, use, like, people kind of know it, even if they don't admit it. We actually don't always know what Trump is going to do, which is...
Yeah, there's a little bit of a casino logic to it, which is that Harris isn't going to do anything very different. But you can place a bet, even if it's a very unlikely low odds situation, you can take a bet on something else happening. And a lot of people are in a position where they'd rather place that bet.
Which is weird because he's a candidate we know, but he's still so chaotic that that even though we know him, we actually, because we know him, we're still like, we don't really know what he's going to do. Like, one of the things I've always found fascinating about Trump versus Harris is a suit who is a cipher and will lie to you to your face. I think about an example where she said she considered doing an arms embargo, and then the very next day her campaign reminded her that she couldn't even promise that, and retracted it. Like that was a thing that happened. Whereas Trump is similarly inconsistent, but he isn't inconsistent in such a clearly opportunistic way that you can actually say that it's insincere. He seems inconsistent and like, no, he just like changed his mind on a dime, and it's like, and he could convince himself of the change. And I don't, it's dangerous to psychologize any figure, but I think that's why he's not perceived as being, and even by his enemies, as being an inconsistent or like flip-floppy candidate, even though, like, if you look at his policy papers in 2016 versus his policy papers in 2021 versus his own response to the project that was built off of his prior policy papers, they're wildly inconsistent. And even his governing coalitions, one of the things about Trump's governing coalitions when he was in office that people, I think, underexplore is, as far as dealing with this polyarchy thing, Trump's answer to it's actually somewhat similar to Biden's, was to put different factions in power almost as a rotating seat. Unlike Biden, he fired them all the time when they pissed him off. But like, it was this like we have a coalition, so like I don't know, let's throw a neoconservative in there and whatever. And while there probably will be less of that this time, I'm not totally sure because I'm still not sure that Trump has that stable of a political identity, and that may be why he's a character for this moment.
I mean, Vivek Ramaswamy and JD Vance have very different politics, and Kushner and Ivanka have very different politics from both of them. It's going to be the same kind of thing. And ultimately, I always expect Jared and Ivanka to win because you can't fire the family. I always expect them to ultimately prevail whenever things get really hot. Everybody else can only do what Jared and Ivanka will tolerate. And if Jared and Ivanka decide that they want you out, you're going to be out eventually.
Right. And I mean, I also think like Vance has very different politics from Vivek Ramaswamy, but Vance is also a mercurial figure. So I find this interesting because when we talk about the two views of power, the view that you have a system that's crushing you, and that's now become the Republican. Interestingly, and surprisingly, because, leftists talk about systems all the goddamn time. And yet the way you actually see politics portrayed from people who are left adjacent is that it's a problem of a person, and this person represents the end of democracy or whatever. And also, I want to point out, and you've talked about this elsewhere, I've heard other people talk about it too, that talking point actually is not popular with most Democrats and almost all Democrat adjacent independents. They actually are not super responsive to the democracy thing. It only seems to work with white college educated liberals. And
it's the Liz Cheney crowd. The Never Trump Republicans are the only people who really believe it. And that's why they were shocked during that window between the debate and Harris. That Biden seemed to have no plan to win the election, and so many Democrats were acting like it was no big deal if they lost. The Never Trump Republicans were foaming at the mouth and going crazy because they couldn't believe that the Democrats didn't actually believe the rhetoric about democracy. But they're the only people, I think, who really believe the Trump poses an existential threat to democracy thing, because they actually did move in response to that and changed their behavior and activity over that point.
Right. Whereas, like, the white educated artist will pick up that rhetoric, but do they actually believe it? I mean, it's hard for me it is really hard for me to deal with the fact that they're not holding their candidate accountable for just peacefully transferring power if they actually believe that Trump is going to completely destroy democracy and become a dictator tomorrow or in January.
If somebody were to try to shoot Donald Trump, my expectation, if I had to guess their ideology, would be Never Trump Republican, would be Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney fan. That would be my guess.
Well, I mean, I think we can look at the weird ideologies of the people who did try to shoot Donald Trump. One of them, we have no idea what their ideology really was, but it does seem to be some kind of centrist ideology, that guy who shot him in the ear. And the other was explicitly NATO based, and about Ukraine. Neither one of them were diehard leftist or even diehard liberals from any evidence that we have. And trust me, if they had any evidence, conservative media would be spinning it. They don't. And so
it's neocons who really believe in the ancient concept of tyranny, principle of Sic Semper Tyrannis. Those are the people who actually believe that stuff.
Yeah, it is actually kind of funny that it's like the people who won an imperial who won an imperial hegemony also actually do believe in old concepts of republicanism in a very strange way. Like, I guess this proves that the neocons actually meant what they said about democracy, even if it was dumb.
They love Cicero, man. That's Cicero, Cato, those are their guys. at the end of the day. If their notion of the canon is that those Roman Republican thinkers are absolutely central.
Yeah. If people were at Strausmore, they'd know that. I guess this leads us to the three critics that you talk about of legitimation. You talk about Althusser, which we haven't brought up, Adorno, and Wayman Goyce. Goyce, yeah. I want to let you participate on that, and maybe we can apply that to contemporary society. So let's start with Adorno. Legitimation as despair. Like, super common.
Yeah. So the thing I love about Adorno is that he has all of these different uses for the concept of ideology, right? And this produces confusion on the part of many people who read Adorno. But the thing that I think is really worth focusing on is this idea that ideology is the thing that maintains the order that drives people to despair, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it maintains the order that drives people to despair, then it is the thing which helps to drive people to despair. It has this role in moving people toward this negative mood. And for me, that's where Adorno really fits in this book. He explains how these legitimation stories eventually produce despair, which he describes as the final ideology. And the reason that despair itself is an ideology is that when you're in despair, you aren't doing anything to overcome the order because you believe you can't do anything about it. And in this sense, despair is the final ideology. It's the last ideology that you're in before you come up with, you enter into the subjectivity of being revolutionary. But then there's this question of, does that really go through now? And, what else can happen apart from that? And so that's really where I'm interested in tearing with Adorno in this book. When you get driven to despair, what comes next? Do you become a revolutionary subject? Well, only if you can imagine something worth struggling for. And if you can't, then what other possibilities are available to you? I think suicidality and suicide by cop, suicide by drone, suicide by lifestyle is one of the major outcomes in recent years that comes out of this confrontation with despair without a political response, without a social organization, political organization you can join that looks meaningful. These other alternatives are often very, very bad for the person in that situation. And that's why there's such a strong impulse, a survival instinct in people to get out of despair through some kind of cope, through some kind of other kind of ideological narrative that will paper over the despair. Even if it's very ironic, even if it's not very sincerely held, even if it's a pragmatist strategy, it kicks away this possibility of suicidality, which starts to lurk when you actually get close to revolutionary subjectivity. The possibility of killing yourself because you don't see something to do starts to be there. And that's where I think things get dangerous. And it's part of the danger that is there for anyone who engages seriously in left-wing thinking for any length of time. That lurks and will raise its head if you get too thoughtful about this and you don't have a praxis, you don't have something to do. It's a danger and it goes after you. I also bring into the book Althusser, in part because I think Althusser highlights that this tendency in the middle of the 20th century to think of the state as this very unitary, totalized thing, and to think of society as something which is acted upon by the state is even replicated within Marxism and even replicated within critiques of ideology. Where Althusser suggests that there are these repressive apparatuses, but also these ideological apparatuses which constitute subjects, right? This idea that the subject is constituted by the state, that the state operates at such a high level of power within society, within the culture industry, that it's able to structure subjects, and that you could only get a revolution when in some way, shape, or form this structuring doesn't come off right, doesn't totally work. This is at play in Althusser's theory explicitly, but also implicitly in lots of other theories that don't think of themselves as Althusserian, but which do involve this unitary state which is acting on society. And I see a similarity between Althusser's account and, say, Koselleck's, even though Koselleck is often thought of as on the right. This idea that there's a state that's in dialogue with the society that the state acts upon is very, very much the same general kind of thinking. And I think that part of why Althusser goes to all of this trouble is that his project is very much about trying to render Marxism analytically precise. In the course of rendering it precise, he concretizes it in a way that makes it less flexible and less able to deal with different distinct situations. One of the things I try to emphasize in the book is that you need different theories of legitimacy and ideology for different moments in history, different contexts and periods, which is why I can say on the one hand that Dahl's theory or Adorno's theory is brilliant and fascinating and very wonderful for describing a time, but doesn't necessarily port directly over into our time. And in seeing the gap between that theory, that period, and our time, we're able to start to think in, I think, a more effective way about what we can do theoretically to adjust for these new circumstances. And that doesn't just mean taking their theory and straightforwardly reforming it. It may mean coming up with something that is different, but it will be informed by why it was that people conceived of legitimacy, conceived of ideology in these ways in the mid-20th century, and why is it that it strikes us today that that would not be the right way to do it. Geuss, I think, is fascinating, because Geuss, enters the scene in the 80s with this book about critical theory, where he's just trying to defend the idea that ideology is a relevant or meaningful concept at all, that we should talk about it at all. So it's a very defensive kind of book, and it involves concretizing it for the purposes of just protecting the idea that it means anything. And he's forced to do that because he's trying to write this in the academy in the 80s. A lot of Marxists do this in the 80s. They try to concretize the hell out of all of it to try to defend it intellectually. But the problem is, it's not an intellectual problem. It's a problem of history. It's a problem of Marxism losing historical steam. So there's no way of just describing it intellectually that will protect it from what is ultimately coming, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the appearance of possibility there. And that's what I really think changes ultimately the way we talk about ideology, is the loss in the 90s of the alternative, and therefore the loss of the idea that liberal democracy has to compete with other regimes and therefore needs an account of why it's better. When you have that, when you have regime competition, the concept of ideology is just obvious. In the Cold War, it's just obvious why you need it, because you have to engage in regime competition. You have to explain why your regime is better than the other regime that exists, right? When you don't have that competition, it seems like it's no longer an important concept. And people start looking to defend it intellectually. But in this book, I think it becomes possible to defend it historically, if only because the possibility of critique has so clearly returned in a way that it had not in the 90s or even in the 2000s before the 2008 crash. We now live in a time when people are very dissatisfied with liberal democracy and even with capitalism, but they're not able to articulate an alternative to it, which is compelling to people at scale. And therefore, it's not obvious how this loss of legitimacy, how this loss of ideology can actually be politically taken up. And this gap is the thing which ultimately either must be filled in by some new account that is actually mobilizing in the relevant old-fashioned sense, an extremely tall order, very tall order, right? Or that won't happen, and we will have this incredibly stuck, very ironist kind of bullshit American politics where we pretend the things that we're saying are meaningful while we do nothing. And I think that's where we are. I think 2024 perfectly encapsulated that kind of election, an election where people said all kinds of stuff they didn't mean, and what will ultimately happen is a whole lot of nothing.
Right. And I guess now we have the Republicans. They look, I mean, it's hard to say with the House. It looks like the Democrats lost this as much as Trump won it until today with California, and Trump's gains in California are actually more significant than people thought. I mean, Harris clearly won it, but Trump has
in
made
New York
up
too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Trump has made up his numbers. It looked like he was winning in a similar way to the way the Tories won, and not Tories. Tories lost to Labour in Britain, which was Labour actually lost a share of votes down from the Corbyn period, but the Tories were so hated for a variety of reasons that it was a landslide for Labour. It was looking like that was happening to Trump. California is, as of when I checked, was like 70% reported, and it looks like actually no, Trump actually did beat his 2020 numbers just slightly. And Harris didn't lose 15 million votes; she lost 11 million. But it still indicates that this was theirs to lose. I found the left response, some of the far left response to this, utterly incoherent because they were both like, I literally saw people who were arguing that we needed not to support Harris within 24 hours argue that this was a sign of the irredeemable racism of American society. Without, and it's kind of incoherent. I don't think it's just us. I mean, I see it across the board. Like, Zionists who will say that they've never supported genocide, talking about the need to bomb people into non-existence just a few months ago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it does actually bring out your point that these people either don't know what they're saying. They're so into the individual moment that there is no view of a longue durée, or they can't mean it, or both. And I think this is also true with the actions around the Trumpist fascism stuff. I think Trumpism can be very, very bad. I don't want to soften that. I think there are communities that might be hurt by this. In fact, I know there will be. But it seems to me that I have a hard time squaring what people talk about in terms of fascism with what they actually do. And I remember, and I can say this now, I remember when I was like, oh, I'd like to punch a fascist. And I was like, if you actually believe that fascism was a real threat, you do a lot more than punching. Just want to point that out to you. And you don't, and I suppose I found that really frustrating, 4 or 5 years ago, when I was like, okay, so you punch a fascist, but do you actually think the Civil War thing's real? Are you willing to go to fight for it? No, you're not. Like, in any real way. And to be fair, even when these people are coming out with AR-15s, most of them aren't either. I'm not saying none of them were. We saw some examples of it, but very few of them were. You might be willing to riot and burn stuff down, but is the violence going to go beyond that? And the answer was actually no. Right. We live in a time period where I think a lot of rightists would love for the left to try January 6th, or the liberals to try a January. I don't actually think the left would do it. To try January 6th, which I've always found interesting, because January 6th was both a legitimate threat to the order and a total farce, like simultaneously. I was like, okay, so this is kind of both a clown show with some real elements of danger into it. And, but then when I point out, like, people died, I'm like, the people who died were like protesters who were not in shape to protest, and they had heart attacks. And that one woman got shot. Like, that's... And a couple of police officers killed themselves afterwards for reasons that we like to link to January 6th stuff, but we don't know. I think maybe one police officer. I say a couple. I only know of one for sure. So this seems like a weird narrative, right? What do we make of that? Do we think? Look, I think prediction is always dangerous. I'm going to put a caveat on that. But do we think we're going to see a liberal or left version of January 6th? I mean, I don't. But
I don't think so. I think people have been insincere about the degree to which they really think that this is a threat. I think people don't actually believe most of what they say about it. And I think that generally the emotion I'm seeing from people is depression. It's a demotivation. I think it will be a weaker response than we saw in 2016. I don't think we'll see anything even as big as the Women's March in 2016. And what's more, I think that the way that we would interpret this, if it happened, it would be like college students occupying the president's building, the president of the university. If you had liberals that were doing something like January 6th, how would it be reported? How would it be covered? I think it would be treated like university students staging an occupation on campus. And those occupations on campus might make the administrators at those universities feel like they're really in danger. But liberals and leftists don't tend to take those complaints seriously when they come in that context. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be similar. I think if we saw something like that, it would be kind of waved off as a group of college students who got unruly, even if some of them did do violence. And this is something that we see all the time. You know, if college students on a liberal campus have a protest and there's some violence around the margins, the right will treat that violence as if it's all that happened. And then the establishment media will minimize that. We saw that with the Black Lives Matter protests, for instance. I think that that's probably the absolute highest horizon of possibility here, something like a campus occupation. But really, I don't see it happening. It seems to me that people really don't believe the things that they've been saying. And if they did, they would act differently.
Right. And it leads me to one question. What do you do if people no longer know what they sincerely mean or not? Because that's like one thing I would say is I would think a lot of people are insincere, but they're not aware they're insincere. I think in the moment that they say it, they think they believe it.
Yeah, it's because people have become convinced that words are action, in part because the concept of acting is so foreign to people today. The concept of actual politics is so outside the horizon of possibility that people pretend that words are action. I've talked to so many people who will start quoting speeches from politicians or things they've heard people say, you know, and that will be their argument for why there is a threat. It will just come down to what was said and how inflammatory and how awful. But this is not how politics is. Politics is about who's willing to shoot whom for what. That's where this goes if you take it there. And if people want to take it there verbally, then they ought to think through what that implies. There is the one thing that I think everybody should bear in mind is that we have heard from generals, colonels, heads of intelligence services who have all said that they consider Trump a potential enemy and someone that they would have removed by force had he, you know, really very seriously attempted to stay on, you know, as opposed to what we
I've
saw.
talked about that before, actually, that there have been many people in the military, and Trump doesn't have a military backing beyond some of the base. And while here, I have a few conservative friends, one of which I even did a Patreon episode with, who was like, well, but they have the soldiers. And I'm like, when in the history of ever has that actually ever mattered? If you have a large part of the soldiers, if you have no generals, and then I'll mention Flynn, as will the left. And I'm like,
no, you have to at least get to the rank of colonel. The lowest rank of leadership for a military coup in modernity is colonels. You can have a colonel's regime. Anything lower than that is not sufficient. You look at polling among active duty troops, and it's not at all by any means, you know, 70% plus for Trump. Some polls will occasionally show Trump a little bit ahead or to have won a little bit more than half, but it's not like he's completely dominating among active duty troops. And in any case, you would need colonels or higher. And the intelligence services really hate him because they're very committed to NATO, to the American foreign policy project, and they view him as a potential threat to that project. So anything he does, there are spies who leak things against him. There are spies who infiltrate anything he tries to start up or organize. And those spies are very good at managing to persuade him and his allies that they're on side. I guarantee you that his movement is absolutely full to bursting with spies, probably already. And it certainly will be once they come in.
Well, this is one something of the
that people just don't really wrestle with at all. And it just shows how not very serious people are about thinking about the state and thinking about politics and how it works.
Yes, Virginia, there is a deep state, as I've said twice. But also, it's not a conspiracy. One thing I would like to maybe think about as we tease this out a little bit is people like, oh, but Project 2025 says he's going to replace these people with loyalists. And I'm like, okay, it's only norms that have stopped presidents from doing that because they did it a lot in the early half of the 20th century and the 19th century, where everything was staffed with loyalists. And that's why these norms that were just norms, they were never laws, are even regulations. They were just norms that you don't do it after World War II. That's faded. Trump is going to do something about that. And they're like, oh, it's going to end the intelligence agency. And I'm like, okay, we've known about Project 2025. I mean, before the liberals started talking about it 2 years ago. And yes, there's some crazy stuff in there. I also will tell you that if you try to do all of it, it would lead to a world war or a military coup. Like, you start talking about like replacing, and Trump doesn't mean it. Like, that seems to be a recruitment document. You know what I mean? To get people that he can staff his administrative state with. But I'm also like, he's also put, this has been out in the world for 2 years. Do you not think the intelligence agencies have been preparing for this for a while? Like, I mean, maybe they are that incompetent. Maybe they are that you know, a lot of the, you know, I read a lot of right wingers, and I've been read Rome McIntyre recently, and he seems to think, oh, they're too foxy to do this. And I'm like, maybe you're underestimating what foxes do. So, you know, like, infiltrate your movement. So
these are people with a very particular set of skills. Yeah, they really are. And if you were to fire all of them, you would not have a functional state. You have to have some of them. And once you're hiring some of them, you're going to get more than you would like to get, because they're going to do a very good job of infiltrating your hiring process. And this is not just true for the spies, it's true for all of the different parts of the administrative state. How many people do they imagine have the actual skills to operate the different parts of the state? How many of these people do they think exist? It's not like you can just fire everybody and replace them with a waiting in the wing. You know, there might be an opposition in terms of, you can elect an opposition and have, you know, a shadow cabinet. There is no shadow bureaucracy. There is no alternative administrative state that includes hundreds of thousands of employees that you can simply hire to replace the existing bureaucracy. And by the way, the idea that the bureaucrats should never be fired by the elected officials, ever, any of them, kind of preposterous, kind of silly, really. You know, if anything, maybe that is something that ought to be shaken up a bit.
I think it will be shaken up, but I also think there's hard limits to, particularly when it comes to the military. I'm like, where are you going to get a bunch of loyalists from staffers in the GOP to go and take over the military?
And there are major offices that require confirmation by the Senate.
Right. Well, I mean,
and those guys are going to have to do a lot of hiring and firing themselves, and they're going to need Senate confirmation to do that.
Right. And the idea that Trump's Senate is totally Trumpist aligned just seems to me also to be somewhat delusional.
Ridiculous. I mean, for one, he's only going to have a handful of senators over 50. How many did he get? Was it 50? What was it?
I think it's 50, like 4 or something. Like,
yeah,
it's 54? Still very narrow. And they hold the if they hold the House, it's very narrowly too.
Yeah,
right?
And many of these senators are people who were threatening to take away his tariff power over the measly little tariffs that he deployed against China during the first administration. And these people credibly threatened to revoke his right to unilaterally tariff over that. And that's why the trade war was so muted. A lot of these Republicans are libertarian free trade types still, you know, and a lot of them are not at all uncritically supportive of the administration. People think that because these Republicans say in public that they support Trump, that they are completely controlled by him. That's not at all the case. You have to say certain things if you're a Republican right now to win. And if you are unwilling to say those things, you're not going to win and you're going to get primaried. But what you actually do in office is a whole different thing. You know, I think back to when McCain voted down the ACA repeal and replace, right? McCain is the one who voted it down because he was going to be out. He wasn't going to run again because he was terminally ill. How many other Republicans in the Senate would have been that vote if McCain was not available to cast it? There's definitely some. But they wanted to create an impression that everyone supported repeal and replace except McCain. That's not the case. That's just an impression we have.
Right. Just like Democrats propose super liberal policies like Medicare for all and Green New Deal actually get on the floor when they are not when they don't have enough of the executive to actually do it. Like you see that over and over and over and over and over again.
Right. Harris co-sponsored the Bernie Sanders Medicare for All bill. Did that mean that she was actually for it? No.
Right. It surprises me, even people who are cynical about politics, who still take these people's statements at face value and not try to look at, like, can you game theoretic out the optics? It's really not that hard.
It's because words are all that's left now. So little else gets done that people only really pay attention to the words and to the language. And they hope that the words and language mean something because it's all they've got that they can do themselves.
Well, that brings me back to both the tainter thing. Society is too complicated for anybody to actually run, particularly off of a singular ideological vision. But two, I think maybe this will be my last question for you this time is, I've had a thesis about hyperpolitics, like Anton Jaeger and them talk about, but I have actually concluded that hyperpolitics is the opposite of what a lot of people think it is. I think Jaeger would actually agree with me on this. That hyperpolitics is a form of depoliticization. It is, like we talked about, like despair is a form of legitimization. Hyperpolitics is a form of depoliticalization, because while you're focused on political subjectivity all the time, you are not doing anything that is actually political, in that you're not participating in local government, you're not advocating for anything, you're not building coalitions, you're not doing any of that. You are focusing on analyzing things the way you would sports, like we talked about with Ukraine. And some of this comes from a real sense of powerlessness, even if you have power. And as a person who gets conned into doing it, I say this because I always say I'm not a pundit. I don't want to be a pundit. And yet I keep on having to be a pundit, whether I want to be or not. That I always say, like, what we do, like what I'm doing right now, what you and I are doing, is a precursor to politics, maybe. But if you just take this as a political statement, I don't know, it's just a hobby. And that's one of the things that I've like struggled with about polarization in America, because you're right, it's like that Hydra stuck in a tar pit, in that the polarization is real. It's not, people think it's fake. It's not fake, but it also isn't based on anything that can move and has no political forwardness or movement. So it's a polarization without effect. And what actually goes on is, maybe there's changes in regimes that matter the people on margin. Maybe there are targeted marginal groups, which there have been always, actually. It's not, people forget about the aughts and, the gay panics and all this. But that at the same time, policy is remarkably consistent. Like I point out that, like, the areas where Trump was successful were not undone by Biden by and large at all. They were maybe rationalized, they were parceled out to different factions, but they weren't undone, which a lot of people take as like left-wing hypocrisy. But I take it as like you do, is like, well, no one, it's not just left-wing hypocrisy. There's no politics there in the first place. Like, there's no movement possible. And, it's a disagreement that I have with Doug Lane. Doug Lane thinks all these liberal, like, dishonest people are going to be removed by this. Or I have a friend who thinks, well, this loss with Harris means we're finally going to get rid of the neocons or whatever. And I'm like, I don't think so. That Hydra head will just pop up somewhere else. What do you make of it? Last thought.
Yeah. Anton's hyperpolitics, I think this is an attempt to compete with fandoms. So as the enclaves, the 4Fs of faith, family, fandoms, and futurism become popular as ways of trying to escape politics, one of the ways that politics tries to compete with these things is becoming more like them. So bring Elon Musk in to the state. Have some futurism in your state, and treat politics like a fandom, like a sporting event. Make it entertaining and fun, so that it has some of the character of that. And make it the basis of your family. Only date people who share your politics. And bring it into the church, and talk about your religion in relation to your politics. These are all ways of trying to prevent people from escaping from politics. But I do think that most people really do want out at this stage. I think there is a very large block of people who really would like to not have to be caught up in any of this. So I really do think that there is a kind of subaltern that is genuinely depoliticized, that doesn't vote, that isn't registered to vote. It's a very large number of people who genuinely want all of this stuff to just leave them alone. And I also think that I like Anton's piece, but I do think that it understates the degree to which corporations structure people's social lives at this point. One of the things I've noticed people on the left doing is making an argument that it's like the 1840s or the 1830s, that there's a kind of social lacuna that can be filled with new forms of social organizing. I don't think that's true. I think corporations and universities and the internet are the structures that play the dominant socializing roles now. And I think that a lot of the frustration, especially on the right, with the woke stuff is really a frustration with the office environment and with office politics that they're not able to express in the workplace. And so it's kicked out into these other spaces because in the workplace, they're terrified of what will happen if they express it because of the dominance of HR culture. And this is something that I think has really fallen out of our discussion lately is corporate culture. Because a lot of what's going on is people hate corporate culture. They hate being called into these stupid meetings where they are fed a bunch of very, very poor stuff that all of us, even if it's nominally left-wing or progressive stuff, we would all recognize this is not the highest instantiation, sharpest or most informative or most helpful stuff a person could hear or be given. There's a ton of this stuff that goes on in the corporate world now, and people are really, really sick of it. And I think that's driving a lot of the activity right now.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Okay, so I think we should wrap this up. I don't want to keep you a whole lot longer. People don't know we were talking for a while beforehand. I really like your book. I think people need to read both your books together. I realize their academic price, so ask for your library to get it, but ask for your library to get it and read it. I think it will help you understand what is going on right now. And while, if you're in one of these heads, there can be like a feeling of a lot of movement too. I think this is one of the things that your book clarified to me. While there can feel like there's movement, and yet you look at the whole system, it's like nothing is changing. Well, I'm in a head of a Hydra. The body's still stuck, right? Like it ain't going nowhere. So, and that's something to think about. Thank you, Ben. Ben, anything you'd like to plug other than the book?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just say here real briefly, I know that the book is too expensive for many people. There will be a paperback within 12 months, and I have been told that it will be significantly cheaper. Maybe not as cheap as it should be, but significantly cheaper. So if you are someone who wants to get it and you don't have a lot of money, I'm sorry, please hang on. And hopefully before too long, I'll be able to put a book out that you can actually buy.
Yes, thank you so much. All right. And people should look up your website, follow your writings. I've enjoyed some of your recent writings. I actually go and stop at Sublation to read pretty much you. I probably shouldn't say that too loud, but I think people should pick that up. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.